Hi, welcome to Friday Referral Club. This is a meeting of Select Counsel, which is a group of small to medium-sized law firm partners, and we meet typically each Friday at 3 p.m. And we talk about sharing referral opportunities, helping each other with the challenges that we face in our respective practices, and other types of activities like that. We do occasionally have guest speakers, so I'm delighted today to have as a guest speaker Joseph DeMarco. So Joseph he can tell you a little bit more about his background in a moment, but he's interesting to our community for really two reasons. Joseph has successfully founded a firm, I guess about 15 years ago. I've known him for a number of years, and he built a successful legal practice, and that's obviously of interest to all of us in this community. And then he's also an expert in how to safely work from home, both safely from our own perspective and from the perspective of the client communications and the client data that we may need to engage with from home, or many of us, certainly in larger cities, need to work from home pretty much all the time for the last few months, and likely for some period of time going forward. We also have today as a guest David Heckler, who's the editor-in-chief of the TAG Cyber Law Journal. And David and I have worked together for approaching 2 years on a monthly working group at In the House, which is a group for general counsel that I also run. And we've been talking about privacy and cybersecurity issues with that group for 2 years. So it's a topic that's really important to all lawyers, both in-house and outside. So David, why don't you lead the discussion, and then Joseph, would love to hear more about your background as well. And I'll just moderate as necessary.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just say that I'm the editor-in-chief of TAG Cyber Law Journal, and we had an article by Joseph DeMarco in our, I think it was April issue, and the cybersecurity and privacy working group that Chris just alluded to, that In the House hosts every month for the month of April, featured Joe doing a talk probably similar to the way this one will be, although we're going to add some details this time around. And Chris is going to send you a link to the resource page for our group. And if you scroll down that resource page to April, you'll see a link to the video that we recorded and the article in TAG Cyber Law Journal that we published before that webinar, or webcast, I should say. So let me just tell you a little bit about Joe so he doesn't have to do that himself. And then I'll tell you the two basic subjects that I'm hoping we'll cover. So Joseph DeMarco is a founding partner of DeVore and DeMarco, a boutique law firm practicing exclusively in the law of data privacy and security and cybercrime prevention and response. From 1997 to 2007, he was assistant U.S. attorney in Manhattan, where he led the computer hacking and intellectual property program. And contact information is available at the bottom of the article that we published in TAG Cyber Law Journal. So you can just click on that link. The two areas that I want him to cover today are first, what should law firms do about their remote working force? And what should lawyers who are working remotely focus on? Sometimes the two could be a little different. And second, what about anticipating a return to the office? What are the risks and vulnerabilities that law firms should worry about? And what should their lawyers worry about as well? So let's start with where we are now, where we seem to be now. And I'm going to sort of take you through some of the areas that you focused on in your article, Joe. But let me start with this. In your opinion, should law firms have written policies that they distribute to all their lawyers, either in advance of, a situation like this where lots of lawyers, if not every lawyer, is working remotely? And if they haven't done that already, is this something you think they should do now?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Chris and David. I think the answer is quickly yes. So let's just kind of take a step back for a moment. I spent all my time helping companies and organizations either after some cyber incident has occurred. It could be a ransomware incident. It could be a theft of funds from a misdirected email, bank account theft. It could be an instance of a data breach exposing client personally identifiable information. I spend a lot of my time helping them at businesses after the fact, and I help a lot of them before the fact, complying with laws in the area of data privacy and security. And it's important to remember that lawyers, in the final analysis in law firms, small, medium, and large, are businesses. And we forget sometimes that they're businesses. We like to think of ourselves kind of in a guild system, subject only to the rules of professional responsibility. But unfortunately, all of the laws that have sprung up in the last 20 or so years regulating how businesses keep and safeguard personally identifiable information, PII, health information, and related information, all those rules apply to law firms. And so I'll just kind of give you an example. The other day, I was helping a law firm where the office manager supposedly got an email from the managing partner of the firm asking the office manager to send the partner everyone's W-2s so that the partner could make some decisions about, how to essentially modify the firm's pay scale in light of COVID-19. In fact, there was a hacker inside the managing partner's email account. So even though the email really did come from the managing partner, when the email went back to the managing partner from the office manager, the bad guys had set up rules inside inside the managing partner's account to forward that email immediately to themselves. Of course, they also set up rules inside the managing partner's email account to delete sent items so that essentially the managing partner, even if he diligently looked at his email account, would not have seen the outgoing email. And because of the rules on the inbound traffic, would not have seen the email coming back to the office manager, from the office manager. Now, that's a data breach because everyone's W-2s have their name and social security numbers and are very rich in PII. And from the point of view of, that breach as compared to, let's say, the Yahoo breach or the breach at the OPM, a few years ago, or any of the big PII breaches that people read about in the newspaper, the only difference is how many people you need to notify. Because it's a law firm, they have employees. This particular law firm was New York City based. They had lawyers that lived in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, a couple of outlier staffs in Pennsylvania. You're going to have to notify those individuals under applicable state breach reporting laws, and you're going to have to notify attorney generals. So even if you are a small solo practitioner or a one-person law firm, if you have personally identifiable information in your care, custody, or control, and you lose that, you're probably going to have a reporting obligation, just like Yahoo did, right? Just like Yahoo did. And why is that? It's because law firms are businesses regulated by the same general rules that regulate all businesses in the United States. So there are those issues. There are issues of, misdirected wire transfers that lawyers often worry about. There are ransomware issues, and that's on the reactive side. On the proactive side, there are also a host of regulations that apply, again, typically at the state level, which relate to how you keep and maintain and secure information. And again, in the article I sent around, and David will hopefully circulate, we talk about recent amendments to New York's SHIELD Act, which essentially says that lawyers that have information on New Yorkers have to keep and maintain policies at the front end before the bad thing happens that relate to how they secure, maintain, and ultimately securely dispose of that information. So again, just kind of, I think if that's the only thing you remember on a Friday afternoon about what I'm saying is that, remember that just because you're a lawyer doesn't mean that all the rules that you read about and the rules that trigger breach notification obligations that trigger the articles that you read about in the paper, all those rules apply to you. And on the front end, on the policy end, with some very limited exceptions, you as lawyers and law firms are subject to the same policies that every other business is in America to keep and safeguard at the policy level, as well as the technical level, information about your clients and their persons.
So David, can I ask a quick follow-up? Since most of us on this call are partners at small to mid-sized firms, Do you know any resources, Joseph, that we could use to sort of look at recommended policies for law firms specifically?
Yeah, so there are a lot of forums out there on the internet for template information security policies or incident response plans. Unfortunately, they're not really geared that well for lawyers and law firms. So unfortunately, no, the bar has been kind of a little bit slow on that front. So I've unfortunately not found those.
Okay, but thank you.
Well,
And if you don't know about them, they're probably pretty hard to find. So
maybe we should start with Zoom and video conference calls. Since we first met and discussed this topic, there's been a whole lot of publicity about Zoom. There was quite a bit in April too, I must say, but there's been a lot more, and Zoom has not been inactive. Zoom has really taken a lot of steps to improve its security. But lawyers have a particular issue here. I mean, there's confidentiality. It's the various ways lawyers may choose to use video conferencing is worth talking about. Why don't I, without trying to specify the question any narrower, why don't you just talk about how you think lawyers and their firms ought to use and how they ought not to use video conferencing?
Sure. So again, the question is a good one. It's a subspecies of the larger question, which is, what technologies for communication is it appropriate for lawyers to use, under what circumstances, when, and why? And it's a question really that goes back to, I would say, 1997 or 1996, when, kind of email really took off as communication modalities among lawyers. The last day I left Cravath in 1997 was the day that they rolled out firm-wide email for all associates. And the last thing I said to myself on the way out the door was, man, it's a good time to get out, because previously the partners that I worked for, had few options to track me down. They could camp on my phone, but that was about it. I didn't have a cell phone. But now I really thought to myself, my God, talk about expecting instantaneous answers. But one of the first questions that came up to bar regulators was, is it okay for lawyers to use email? Is the use of email appropriate, or does it pose undue security risks? And one of the first Bar Association opinions that the New York State Bar Association Professional Responsibility Committee issued was on that question. And essentially the answer is the same now as it was back then. There have been several updates to it, but the short answer is, yes, it is okay for lawyers to use generally applicable communication methodologies in the course of their business. However, if the lawyer is using communication methodologies that pose risks to their client, they shouldn't be using those communication methodologies, or should put in place compensating controls. And the example the bar gives is, if you're corresponding with your client in a labor employment dispute scenario and you're representing the employee, be sure to tell the employee not to use their work email account to communicate with you, right? It's a very commonsensical thing. Now, the same advice I would submit to you can also be applied to cordless phones, which are actually less secure than old-fashioned, plain old telephone system POTS landlines, cordless phones. The same answer applies to cell phones and mobile phones. The same answer applies to video conferencing. And the truth of the matter is, for most of what we do as lawyers, we really don't need enhanced security. Now, that's not always the case. That's not always the case, and I recognize that. But for the most part, lawyers who use generally applicable communication platforms, using the security features available to them and taking ordinary precautions for most communications, are going to be, operating well in the baseline of care. Obviously, you would never be at I see a football stadium back there. You would never be at a football stadium talking to your client on the speakerphone of your cell phone, right? You would never do that. But for most clients and for most lawyers, a Zoom call is no less problematic or insecure, again, assuming you've deployed the security features, password protecting the call, sending the password outside of the email invite, than any other call. Another important point, though, is just because you have the ability to do a video conference call, a question I always ask is, do you really need to do a video conference call? Again, most times a landline is more secure than a cordless phone, and a cordless phone is a little bit more secure than a video conference call, perhaps. So if you really don't need to use a Zoom or video call to communicate, why not just pick up the telephone? There's nothing wrong with that too. Again, there are going to be situations, and what I do is in my engagement agreement, I'm happy to give anyone who wants the language, just send me an email. In my engagement agreement, right at the front of our representation, I flag to the clients that in the course of representing them, we will be using communications platforms that are traversing networks that are inherently insecure, like the phone network and the internet. And if they want enhanced security, they're to let me know, and they're agreeing to pay for enhanced security. In 10 years since I've put that clause in my form engagement agreement, I've had 3 clients who've asked for enhanced security. On 2 occasions, we were able to find free tools that address their security needs. In 1, very sophisticated security requirements, we deployed tools that they paid for. Other than that, most clients are like, yeah, that's fine, you know, just obviously take care to, you know, not be speaking on the speakerphone when you're out at a shopping mall. Not that people go to shopping malls anymore.
So Joseph, since you offered to communicate by email, would you be okay if I posted your LinkedIn profile into the chat and people could connect with you if they had questions? Okay.
Or just my email address. I have a pretty bare bones LinkedIn account for a host of reasons.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so I will just post your email address in there so people. So go ahead, proceed, David and Joseph. I just wanted
Okay, well, you touched on one of the big areas, unsecure personal and public Wi-Fi networks. And even secure Wi-Fi at home isn't necessarily the most secure kind of. It's not generally going to be as secure as presumably your work Wi-Fi setup. But why don't you talk about the dangers, the risks of Wi-Fi in general and public Wi-Fi in particular?
Sure. So look, what you want to be sure, and this is in the article that David will circulate, or Chris has posted the link to, what you want to be sure on with regard to Wi-Fi is that, number one, you know, you're on your network or a network that you know and trust. You know, I walk around my block. I've been working from home. My office is Manhattan, but I've been working from home in Greenwich, Connecticut ever since. I walk up and down my block and I see picked up on my iPhone a dozen networks, right? Some of them are not secured. Some of them are secured. You want to always be sure that you're on your network. And obviously that's easy to make sure at home. You want to be sure, and this, your provider, your communication company or whatever can provide you with information on this. You want to be sure that your router and Wi-Fi hotspot is updated and that you're operating on WPA2, which is the more secure version of Wi-Fi connectivity. You also want to be sure that your router is secured with a robust password, not the default password that may have come with it. That's pretty much enough for home use. When you're traveling, and people obviously are going to be traveling again, you always want to be sure that you're on a trusted network, or just using your cellular connections, which are more secure. The reason for that is bad guys will sometimes set up fake hotspots and just sit outside public areas, like let's say LaGuardia Air Terminal or JFK Air Terminal. They'll set up a fake, or it's a real hotspot, but it's one that they control, called like JFK airports. And there'll be no password, and people will go onto it, and that enables them to capture the traffic traversing that hotspot. We helped a law firm this past summer that had a breach of very sensitive litigation-related material. Essentially, a trial plan was stolen and found its way into their adversaries' hands. And one of the ways that it might have leaked out is when the partner was in the business class lounge of British Airways at JFK using a Wi-Fi hotspot that he ultimately wasn't sure was legitimate or not. So that's kind of the issue with Wi-Fi.
Okay, I'm just gonna, while I'm thinking of it, I'm gonna mention that I wrote an article about a pending case where a law firm is being sued by a client who is a prominent Chinese dissident who hired the law firm with the understanding that they would take special measures to make sure his information they provided to them, it was an application for asylum in the United States, his information would not be hacked because he'd previously been hacked often by the Chinese government. And it was. So they didn't keep it off the internet, which is what he understood they promised to do. And then the judge allowed this case to go forward. I'm just going to send that link to Chris afterwards so that all the information that you're already going to get, you'll have that too, because it's sort of like, you know, how dangerous this can be for a law firm potentially.
Right.
Anyway.
That seems that case is kind of extraordinarily unfair, at least at the surface level, because you have a law firm up against the resources of a gigantic country. So
the law firm made a promise
right.
to this client. It's not a typical situation. The client
Right.
said, "I've been hacked a lot." And they said,
Yeah.
we promise." At least that's what the judge decided there's sufficient information to let this case go forward. It's really interesting. It's very unusual.
Yeah.
But for that reason in particular, really interesting. Anyway, what about the idea, Joe, and this is an area you covered, of transferring corporate data using personal email accounts while you're sitting in your remote office?
Yeah, again, a very, very dangerous idea. You know, many of the common free webmail email platforms have had major compromises. The Yahoo breach, you know, is kind of the most prominent one. Over, I think, 1 billion, you know, credentials lost. Getting back to the case I mentioned where a trial plan was stolen from a big firm partner. Another way that the bad guys might have gotten that trial plan was because the partner, to avoid his firm's very robust data leakage prevention policies, emailed the trial plan to himself to his Yahoo account so that he could work on it from the business class lounge of British Airways at JFK and on the way over across the pond. And it took us, you know, when he told us about that, obviously we went through all the different ways that he could have lost it. And there were others too. You know, when he told us about that, it took us all of about, I mean, I work with investigators that do this for a living. It took us all of about 6 minutes to find his stolen password on the dark web. So again, that's another reason why you don't want to be using that. The other thing too is, you know, a lot of people, lawyers will share those personal accounts with family members, and, you know, family members may be sloppy about their own data hygiene as well. So again, probably not a good reason. I mean, look, by the way, everything I'm saying to any of you that have either banks as clients or healthcare providers that are clients or government contractors that are clients, I mean, all of this is going to seem very basic because most likely those clients have forced you to build to more secure standards in order to be an approved vendor to them. And again, I know we don't like to think of ourselves as vendors or subcontractors, right? Or service providers, but unfortunately that is the box we fall into. And, you know, again, just to give you an example, New York State Department of Financial Services, which governs all insurance companies chartered by New York State and all banks chartered by New York State and all foreign banks with branches in New York State, has a specific requirement which requires those entities to make sure that their third-party service providers, which includes their law firms, outside law firms, comply with the standards that are set forth in the statute, which, you know, again, all this stuff is very basic too. So, and even if you just do, you know, let's say mortgage refi work, your banking and financial service lenders are going to make you do all this stuff anyway. So hopefully, you know, if you have those clients, you've already done this or you're in the process of doing it.
Can I have a brief follow-up, one comment, and then a question for Joseph. So my comment is, in my own small legal practice, I've really learned in the last 5 years that there's some great sort of security resources for small businesses. One example, there's competitors, but I happen to use something called 1Password, and it generates arbitrary 25-character passwords. And they're very difficult to hack, even for very sophisticated hackers. And this is something, I think it maybe costs me $100 a year. And so this is something almost any law practice can afford. And yet, instead of, you know, having a little book with your passwords in it or trying to remember them, you have this arbitrary set of passwords. And even a small law firm probably has at least a dozen accounts of various sorts, right? And if you keep them all in a password vault like that, it's very secure. And I would venture to say it's as good as anything an AMLAW 100 firm would have in terms of just raw security, or at least close. So that's my comment. My question is, Joseph, do you think that how hard is it for a smaller law firm to sort of be very secure? And what are some of the resources that you might be aware of that, like the way I use a password vault, what are some things smaller law firms could do to maybe punch above their weight when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's a great question. The other thing I would add too is, you've not just taken care to use robust passwords, either, again, ones you've made up or ones generated by tools like you mentioned, but you've also enabled two-factor authentication wherever possible.
Yeah.
So that, if someone logs in and it's not coming from a recognized IP address or something like that, you will get a text on your email, or there are apps, authenticator apps that do the same thing. So I think that, there are options out there. One good news, one bright spot is for all the lawyers that are out there that are solos or at small law firms. I mean, we're 6 lawyers with 1 commercial office in Midtown Manhattan. It's very easy, relatively speaking, to secure a small law firm as compared to a medium-sized or a big law firm, because your attack surface is so much smaller, right? I mean, it's hard to, I would say the hardest law firms to secure are in the 100 to 200 lawyer law firms, because they're big enough that their attack surface is big, but they're not so big as to, let's say, be able to deploy Fried Frank or Skadden-like, sophisticated tools. They don't have a chief information security officer. But if you're a solo or a small person, there are a lot of, your attack surface is much smaller. You don't have, presumably, summer interns coming and going, summer externs dialing to the network and not. It's a relatively small number of people. I would say, deploy all the security tools that you can. And there are a lot of free resources out there on how to secure small business networks. And that's really what you are. You are a small business network. And there are a lot of tools out there. And again, because you control it and you're the gatekeeper, you at least don't have to worry about someone else messing up. Now, you can always mess up, and there's nothing we can do about that. Any of us tomorrow could fall victim to a phishing attack, but at least you don't have to worry that someone else is going to mess up.
Okay.
What about
one of the issues that you brought up in your article was we talked about transferring corporate data through your email account. What about after the data is in your possession, in your personal account, and this kind of flash forward into going back to the office? What about that? What are you supposed to do there?
Sure. So one of the most important things, I think, is to realize right now that there will be a day when we all get back to the office. Now, again, some of you may work from home full time, so this applies obviously less to you. But for those of you that do have commercial office space and are going to be going back, I would just say, remember that right now, you should be practicing good data hygiene, which is to say, you should either not be using things like thumb drives, or if you use them, treat them like fine jewelry with regard to how much care you put into tracking where they are. The other day, my 11-year-old daughter, metaphorically speaking, like the other day, like on one of her last days of school, she just dumped her her backpack on the kitchen floor, and outspilled, the crumpled up peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a whole bunch of, but then like thumb drives. And I'm like, what's that? Why is there a thumb drive in your bag? She said, oh, I don't know. And it must have fallen in there at school. Well, I didn't plug it in, but for all I know, that could have been a thumb drive that was, some hedge fund guy's, thumb drive that fell into his son's backpack. And then, in the scrum of school, one person's backpack falls into another. Now, again, there could be malware on that, or maybe not, or maybe I just plug it in and there's like, some Greenwich hedge funds, highly confidential information that I've now got. So practice good data hygiene, know where your thumb drives are, or don't use them at all, even better. Have a dedicated office space. Don't be working on shared laptop, shared computers at home if you can avoid it. And then make sure that you, have either a shredder, a crosscut shredder at home, or a shred bin at home, a folder, a Redwell, and you bring that back and then shred it back in the office. So I would say practice good data hygiene at home so that you bring back to your office all of your office work that needs to go back, but nothing else.
There's also great and inexpensive shredding services, because I'm a litigator, and I've been litigating from home for a few months, and I've accumulated some boxes of stuff. They're very inexpensive services that will come right to your home or your office. They'll shred it basically right in front of you, so you see it happening, and it's very inexpensive. So it's nothing a client's going to complain about. It's very low cost.
So as the head of your firm, it's one of the main partners of your firm, have you yet established certain rules that you're going to roll out for the return of your colleagues to the office?
So we have. I mean, we take privacy and security as seriously as you know, as we can. And the rules are what I've just mentioned. So people are working on dedicated devices. They'll bring those devices back to the office, and data will be transferred from those devices as needed to the office server in a controlled manner. Papers and other things that relate to client work will come back. They'll be examined and either filed or shredded upon the return. And we don't use thumb drives, so I don't really have to address that at all. And then obviously as a team, we're going to go through whatever mail hasn't been forwarded and anything else that's accreted. We're going to physically examine the server, physically examine the office space. We're going to, if there are any, thumb drives that people have laid around, they're getting thrown away. They're going right into the secure destroy bin.
So David, I wanted to mention, David, we only have about 20 minutes left. So if we wanted to open it up to questions.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to, I had my eye
Let's
on
pause to see if people do have questions. You can write them in the chat window, but we would encourage you to, if you're, I guess we'll get to open up the, unmute the microphone.
Yeah, let me unmute all.
Jump in at your
I'll
discretion.
unmute all. Please, if you think you're generating background noise, then unmute your.
And by the way, people can always feel free to just email me directly or, and I'm happy to answer questions offline anytime.
Joe, I have a question. So hold on. So, I've been sort of following in New York, right? They have like the guidance for phase 1, guidance for phase 2, those kinds of things. And I have just for context, I have a firm of 11 lawyers. And, I've talked to some of my colleagues at big firms, right? And they are, fully prepared to bring in somebody to take people's temperatures at the door and to make sure the hand sanitizer is full and to make sure people have masks and things like that. But they have the resources to have people that can go around all the floors and do that. As smaller firms, mid-sized firms, like I don't have a person to do that. If I was going to do that, I'd probably have to do it myself. And so do you have any sort of ideas or guidance about, how to comply with some of these requirements that various governors, in particular here in New York and, for the phase 2 guidance about how we can comply with that, or resources where we could hire somebody temporarily to help comply with that? Because I just think I might just have to stay closed until that guidance no longer exists. If there's just no way I could comply with it.
It's a great question, and a call I have for early next week is with my outside labor and employment counsel to go through those very issues. Look, my area of law is the law of data privacy and security and cybercrime prevention and response. I refer everything else out and rely upon lawyers that I hire to answer those very questions. It's a great question. It's obviously going to be state specific, metropolitan area specific. I'm teed up to ask it. I don't think we'll get back, into New York office buildings in Midtown until July. So it's on my list, but a great question.
I think Scott had raised his electronic hand. So
yeah, thank you. I came in a little bit late. I will not ask any questions that's already been discussed, but in terms
Don't worry.
Okay. Do you recommend using some sort of VPN when you're dialing in from home or dialing in from, Starbucks or wherever? I think we all like to, probably can't do it right now, but in the past, we like to, maybe go to a Starbucks and sit down and start working on something Do you recommend just not doing that or doing that with a VPN, or what are
Yeah,
what are
well,
your thoughts?
it's a great question. I mean, well, let's be clear. What the VPN is a virtual private network. It creates a secure tunnel, between, essentially the wireless hotspot and, the connectivity in your building. If your laptop is infected or if you're on unsecure Wi-Fi, it's not going to help you much because that's kind of where the bad guys can grab the information.
I got it. Okay.
There are different tools. There's go to my PC, log me in. Those are all pretty good. Again, the key is, though, make sure that you have two-factor authentication enabled, because again, if someone got your log me in ID and password, then they could just log in and virtually private, VPN into your network, and that would obviously be a really bad thing. So be sure to enable two-factor authentication where possible on those VPN tools.
So Joseph, a follow-up on the coffee shop question. It's sort of a dumb question, but I'm curious. Is if a coffee shop has a password, does that make it secure or not make it secure?
I mean, it makes it more secure.
Right.
My own personal practice is to use my cellular network connection,
Right.
except when I'm in my office or in my home.
Yeah, I think that's a good, smart policy because the unlimited data plans have come way down in cost in the last 5 years. And, even if you have overage fees, it's a small price to pay for that added level of security. So just get in the habit of using your phone as a hotspot, I think makes a lot of sense.
I'm going to throw in one more link that Chris can send out because there's a guy who's got a secure hotspot available for sale. It's new. It's just on the market. Sounds interesting. Be worth kind of being aware of anyway.
Yep. If you'll gather those various links and documents, David, I'll just over the weekend I'll send an email out to our email list and just say, here's all the stuff you might have missed, and some of that I posted in the chat window, but that's a little labor intensive for people to grab all the information from the chat window.
And one of the areas you touched on, more than touched on, Joe, is all these fake COVID donation sites. And there are lots of different COVID information sites, donation sites. Phishing has become like a 24/7 enterprise. And it's only increased exponentially since you wrote your article. So how do you propose for firms to train their people to avoid, these increasingly effective pitches?
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is, unfortunately, there is no, the criminals are without shame or remorse. And, when I was working at the U.S. Attorney's Office during 9/11, shortly in the aftermath of that, we saw 9/11 charity fraud. I saw in private practice charity fraud following Superstorm Sandy in 2013. And we're seeing a lot of both charity fraud and also just general crime linked to COVID-19. So, you might get an email from a client saying, COVID-19, client X has implemented COVID-19 payment plan for all suppliers and vendors. And it looks like it comes from, and in fact does come from, a compromised email account at your client. And you click on it and your machine is infected with some type of malware or ransomware or both. It's very hard to not fall prey to those, especially as, people are being distracted, the kids want to play outside and, you just want to click on the link and see what it is, and boom, then you're infected. My general advice is, obviously, if it's just you don't need to train anyone. You can just kind of read up on the issue yourself. But to the extent you have a small firm with 2, 4, 5, 6 people, make sure that all of them are properly instructed never to click on a link or an attachment unless they are 100% sure that it is legitimate. And that could mean, before they click on the link, picking up the telephone and calling the sender to verify that that is correct, and not the sender's phone number in the email, right? The sender's phone number that you have through some out of bandwidth modality. And if you're not 100% sure, then you know what? You can ignore it. I have done that, and you'd be surprised if it's important, people will actually call or follow up. And I had to confirm the legitimacy with one of my major clients who moved from paper checks to ACH during the COVID pandemic. And it was someone who had never dealt with before. I tracked them down through the main number of the business that I found online. And I just had a conversation with them and, asked them a few questions about work at the business that only someone who really worked at the business would know the answer to. And at the end of the call, the person in accounts payable said, "It's very nice of you to actually just get to know me. No one ever asked that. They just yell at me, when are they getting my money?" And I just said, well, I just, just with all that's been going on, I just wanted to just see how you were and get a sense that, and I left it at that. I didn't say I wanted to be absolutely sure that you were the accounts payable person for company X.
Yeah, one thing that's a related issue, when you get emails not from a client, but from, say, an institution like a bank, and it has a link to click on, I've just adopted the practice. I just never click on that. I go directly to the bank website or maybe call, depending on what it is. I'm sure 99% of the time it's not a phishing thing, but I still just have this practice of I just go directly to the website. I log into my secure web link, and then the same message is going to be there on the online platform. So you might as well just get in the habit of doing that. The other little thing you can do that's just I've learned just in the course of practice is when you get an email from somebody, you can actually look at the actual email address behind the mask pretty easily. You just kind of right click on it. And very often I get these weird seeming emails that look like they're from Google or somebody like that for G Suite or something. But then when you right click it and open it, it's sort of this random email address that does not end in google.com or gmail.com. And you just know it's a fake thing, right? So some of these things are pretty easy. You just need to get in the habit of checking them.
And that'll help you, in all cases where someone's made up an email address, but if they're really in the sender's box,
that's the problem, right?
Which is why you have to be extra cautious as to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other question from
you? Yeah, we're down to the last few. Yes.
And Joseph, first of all, thank you very much for your time. This has been very helpful, very informative. So I have a lot of entrepreneurial clients, and their email extension is Gmail, and that always bothers me. How much of a concern should that be?
Look, again, if it's properly secured and they have robust passwords that they change frequently with two-factor authentication, it's not a shared email box, it's not that bad, but the problem is most people don't do all those things.
Right.
That's the issue.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A related question is, how about texts? I mean, some of us might have clients that text us. How concerned should we be about carrying on attorney-client communications via text?
I mean, texts are generally speaking more secure, again, because they ride on the cellular network. To really pull off a text impersonation, you'd almost need to do like a SIM card swap.
Right.
Not impossible. I had a cryptocurrency company that the chief compliance officer was subject to a SIM swap. So his texts were not secure after that point, but far less problematic. Again, obviously, if someone gets a hold of the device belonging to the person, and either it's not password protected or they get the password, then it doesn't matter. So there too, just be sure that you really are talking to the person. Maybe just call and get an oral verification.
And how about like Telegram and some of these encrypted text apps? Do you have any thoughts on those? And
yeah, pretty good. Some of my clients use them, some don't. Again, only as good as the security of the device that they're installed on.
And Dylan, did you have your hand up? I thought.
Yeah, I had a quick question about electronic file storage. I know we've talked a lot about communication and Wi-Fi, and this is fresh in my mind because a small law firm here where I'm at out here in Idaho recently was the subject of a ransom attack where they, got a message saying, we're the only ones with the password to your servers and pay us 20 grand. And I was appalled that this small firm of, let's say, a handful of attorneys had their own dedicated servers like you referenced before. And they just don't seem like the type of firm that has the resources to have their own dedicated servers and whatnot. So it reinforced to me that for small firms like us, we ought to be storing our electronic files in the cloud with these robust cloud-based companies. But is that the wrong conclusion? Is that something that can happen even with those?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The issue, the really issue is not whether you're using a server or whether you're your own server in an office or whether you're, using a cloud solution. The question is, how have you secured it? So with regard to a cloud solution, do you have robust passwords? Do you change them frequently? Do you control the passwords? Do you have multi-factor authentication? Once you're in, let's say, pick a provider, AWS, Rackspace. Once you're securely in their network, you've got very good security protecting you. The question is the access controls, and that's where we see clients, fall down, quite frankly.
Excellent. We maybe have time for one more question. Does anyone want to get the last word in or the last question in? No?
If not,
very good questions.
Yeah, well, I'll just close by saying, don't just think about this stuff when the awfulness has happened. Think about, again, putting in place policies and procedures before your client asks for a copy of your information security plan or your incident response plan in an RFP, and then you have to go, what's that? Can I get back to you? Be sure you understand what your requirements are as it relates to having proactive plans in place beforehand. I mean, even small firms like me, before we go back to the office, we're going to have a written COVID plan in place. The same applies to information security and data privacy.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, I think one of the few silver linings of the current work from home environment is some of us are saving on commute time. We have a little more flexibility in our schedule. We're not coaching kids games and things like we sometimes do. So we have a little more time in our week to do things like planning, and it's a great time to do those things. So I think that's great advice, Joseph. Well, thank you so much for appearing this Friday at our weekly meeting. And David, thank you for co-hosting today. And once David sends me that information he alluded to, I like the electronic clap, James. That's that's very good. Very, very tech savvy there. I'm like a typical lawyer, I guess. So once David sends me those articles and links, I will get that out to our email list. So thanks, everybody, and have a safe and enjoyable weekend.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you,
Take
everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Pleasure. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye-bye. Thank you.